Miigwech. Welcome back, everyone, to Robinson Huron Treaty Week, Day 2. Very happy to be focusing on our annuities work today. As you know, we've heard from a lot of members of our annuities team this morning. And now we're very honored and happy to hear from our legal team to provide us some overview and history of our treaty and our court case. So I'm going to pass it over to our legal team, Diane Corbier and Chris Albanati, who are joining us. I'll pass it over to you, Diane. Miigwech.
So ani bojo waj geshnedo kwed dishnakazin mukwa dodem chiging donchaba. So as Cheryl indicated, my name is Diane Corbier, and I'm one of the legal counsel for the Lake Huron and Anishinaabe plaintiffs, represented by Mike Ristoul, Patsy Corbier, Duke Pelche, Peter Recollet, Dean Sayers, and Roger Daybutch. Presenting with me today is Chris Albanati from our firm. He's also legal counsel, and if you watch our live stream and continue to watch, he's one of the only ones who's always there. So he'll be addressing you next. I want to start today's talk with treaty history from an Anishinaabe perspective, and Chris will then continue the presentation of the Robinson Huron treaty history. The history of the Robinson Huron Treaty needs to be understood through the Anishinaabe perspective. I'm sure we would all agree with that. And an important part of the Anishinaabe perspective is Anishinaabe laws, and a central part of Anishinaabe law are Antokanen. As I mentioned, the Lake Huron and Anishinaabe are represented in the current litigation by Mike Ristoul, whose dodem is Wajashk, or in English, muskrat. So to help situate you in the Anishinaabe perspective, I wanted to start with the story of the muskrat and talk briefly about what this story tells us about the Anishinaabe understanding of the Robinson Huron Treaty. Of course, to properly tell this story, it could go on for some time. We did have snow on the ground this morning, and I will just be summarizing here today. The story begins with Nana Bojo avenges the death of his nephew and kills the great water being. This causes the earth to flood. Nana Bojo finds himself in ever-rising waters, and as the waters have risen, he comes across a log. So he's floating along on this log, and soon he's joined by a number of other animals who are taking a break from swimming around. And soon they're floating on this log, and Nana Bojo's looking around and thinking, what have I done? They see nothing but the sky and water. There's no earth to be seen. And so Nana Bojo decides that he's going to dive down to bring up some of that earth. So he dives down, but he runs out of breath, and he comes up to the surface. And the other animals say, we're going to help you. So they decide to take turns diving down in the waters. So first, the loon dives down, a great swimmer. He's unsuccessful in being able to bring up some of that earth. The hell diver, or otter and turtle, each take their turn diving down in the waters trying to bring up earth. They are all unsuccessful. And so the animals are deliberating, what are we going to do? When they hear a little voice say, I think I can try. And they look around, who said that? And they turn and see the little muskrat on the log. And Helldiver says, I don't know how this little muskrat thinks he's going to reach the earth when I couldn't do it. I'm a great swimmer. And a few of them are looking bewildered at the little muskrat who thinks that he'll be successful. And Nana Bojo stops them and says, no, let him try. We should all be given a chance to try. Let's let this little muskrat try. So that little muskrat takes a big breath and dives down as deep as he can. And he can see that earth off in the distance, but he is still some distance from it. And he's running out of breath when he lets out his breath to propel himself down to the bottom, and in the process has, again, let out all his breath. The animals are waiting quite a long time and wondering what's happened to their little brother, the muskrat, when they see him come up to the surface. So Nana Bojo brings him over, and they realize that their little brother has died in his efforts to bring up some earth. But clenched tight in his little paw is a morsel of dirt. And so the animals all rejoice, and their brother, the muskrat, who's given his life so selflessly, was able to bring some of the earth back up. And then Turtle says, well, I too will make a sacrifice. I will give you my back on which to build this earth anew. And so with that, Nanabojo takes that small piece of earth and he calls on the four directions and breathes into that earth and places it on the turtle's back, and they dance around. And this is why we call Turtle Island, Turtle Island. The land is built anew on the back of the turtle. The spirit name, Wajash, one of the named representative plaintiffs in this case, Mike Ristul, takes on a special significance. His ancestor was seen as the smallest and meekest, but in the end, he was the only one who could risk everything to dive down and bring up a clump of earth so that the land could be made anew on the back of the giant turtle for the benefit of all living things. The role of muskrat in creation story teaches us about a key principle of Anishinaabe law, resurgence. Resurgence is about the renewal of Anishinaabe lands, languages, cultures, and legal traditions when they have been submerged and drowned by the rising waters of colonialism. While it is impossible to go back to the way things were before the Great Flood, resurgence reminds us that Anishinaabe must remain firmly grounded in the foundational philosophies and principles that define them as a people. Another principle that can be drawn from this story is that of reconciliation. Reconciliation is about interdependence on each other and the extraordinary value contained in the selfless acts of the smallest and most underestimated. As Dr. Stark in the Robinson Huron Annuities case told this story, the story highlights, and I'll quote, the importance and centrality of bringing up from the bottom, from the earth, those foundations to build the world anew. So it's the Anishinaabe laws, the philosophies that the animals are diving down for to bring up to build the earth anew. And if we think of this story then in relation to treaties, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, we can see that Anishinaabe leaders were entering into treaties with the Crown during rapidly changing times, where they recognized that treaties could bring mutual benefit to all parties and bring forward a new kind of world that would acknowledge they were well aware of the fact that much of their world was already submerged underwater, if you will, that times were changing and that the way to stay afloat in these rapidly changing times is both to bring people into the deep relationship on that log, but also to bring forward the legal principles that had ordered how they've always lived on creation. Or in other words, the Anishinaabe entered into treaty to create relationships and reconcile with the newcomers. You see, not all the animals on the log were Anishinaabe. They represent everyone on Turtle Island. They found a way to live together to reconcile their stories. Now, Chris, hopefully you can take it over from there. I don't see you yet. There you are. Welcome, Chris.
Miigwech, Diane.
On mute.
Miigwech, mabeti ikaw ito Chris Albanadi. Nesanay sa Tubambang, mga value, abogado yu Anishinaabe Lake Huron. So my name's Chris Albanadi, and I am one of the legal counsel for the Lake Huron Anishinaabe in the Ristul case. So I'm going to give the history of the Robinson Huron Treaty territory, or of the treaty. And to start, I think it's most important to situate us within the territory that is covered by that treaty. And so I'm going to share with you here a map. And don't know if you can see this map on the screen here. This is a map of Upper Canada in 1838, and it shows that all the new settlements and townships at that time, let's zoom in here, reached as far as Lake Simcoe. Now, just north of this is the treaty territory, and I'll zoom back out again so that you can see the scope of it. This is a territory that's quite vast and roughly equivalent to the size of France. And so it stretches along the north shores of Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, all the way to Batchewana Bay, just past Bouting, Sault Ste. Marie, and up to the Height of Land. Roughly, the treaty territory makes up what at the time the mappers and surveyors had just labeled as immense forests and a great tract of wilderness. So in 1838, this is all Anishinaabe country. So Anishinaabe a king. Now, in the stage one reasons, the court had made several findings about the Anishinaabe relationships in Anishinaabe a king. The Anishinaabe connection to and relationship with Anishinaabe a king was and is central to the Anishinaabe worldview and central to their understanding of the treaty. The trial judge in stage one recognized this, and I'll quote from her reasons. When the Anishinaabe speak of creation, they recognize that they were brought into a complex web of relationships operating across the land. As the last placed within creation, the Anishinaabe could not act in ways that would violate those relationships that came before their placement on the land and that were already in existence across creation. And so, of course, this ties in with the story that Diane led off about the story about creation, about Wujush, the muskrat. So the Anishinaabe relationship with the land is the bedrock of their society, of their understanding and worldview. Two of the organizing principles of Anishinaabe laws and their systems of government were found by the judge and also reflected there. The first was Pamatsvang, life, where everything is alive and everything is sacred. The second was, and forgive me, I'm still learning, Juadzuan, the way of the creator, which encompassed the seven grandfather teachings or seven sacred laws of creation. Anishinaabe understand themselves as merely one part of creation, deeply connected to and interdependent on the larger collectivity of other beings. The Anishinaabe engage with creation in meaningful ways that nourish and balance them physically and spiritually. Anishinaabe have always been open to new aspects of the deeply interdependent world and relationship with Anishinaabe a king. But they could not have agreed to a treaty that would sever their relationships with the land or compromise their ability to continue being sustained from that relationship. Apart from established protocols for sharing territories, Anishinaabe were exceedingly strict with regard to unauthorized intrusion into their territory. And I point this out because this is really the premise or the backdrop, if you will, of why the Robinson-Huron Treaty, why we have the Robinson-Huron Treaty today and what led up to it, which I'm going to get into. So through treaties, the Anishinaabe did not give up their relationship to the land, but rather they extended it and shared it with the crown. So as we were talking about, and as we can see on the screen here, in 1838 and up to the time of the treaty, and even for some time after, the population in this entire area was almost exclusively Anishinaabe. In fact, our expert evidence that was led and which wasn't disputed was that it was essentially greater than 99% Anishinaabe people living in this, what the Crown at the time in 1838 called the Great Tract of Wilderness and immense forests. So there were some Anishinaabe people living at or around trading posts, or non-Anishinaabe people living around the trading posts at Bouting here in Sault Ste. Marie and Michipicoten up here. But apart from that, this is all Anishinaabe king. So territories, lands, and waters that the Anishinaabe have an inherent relationship with, that they've had this relationship with since time immemorial. And this is an important part to understand because apart from a military garrison at Penetanguishene in this sort of area, there was no state apparatus or really physical crown presence in the territory. There's nothing that said this is, the crown asserting or enforcing jurisdiction in this immense territory here. And so really, in order to sort of depend on anything, the crown, for the crown's presence, I guess, if you will, the crown depended upon its long-standing alliance and treaty relationship with the Anishinaabe to protect the territory from incursion from others. For instance, United States, others down here who might want to start encroaching upon this territory here. And so then to understand that backdrop, we have to kind of understand the history of that treaty relationship. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the Covenant Chain Alliance. So the history of the Crown-Anishinaabe Alliance relationship dates back to the 1750s, during the 7 Years' War, when the French and the British fought for control over what is now Ontario and Quebec in the northeastern United States. At the start of the war, the Anishinaabe had been in a military alliance with the French, and for much of the war, the British were unable to defeat them. A pivotal point came in 1760 when the British, through Sir William Johnson, the first Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, were able to convince the Anishinaabe and other former French allies to remain neutral. This contributed significantly to the ability of the British to prevail over the French. However, holding on to control of the territory was not guaranteed. The British did not conquer the Anishinaabe in 1760, despite some of the British that thought otherwise. And this fact became clear over the next 3 years. The British started to occupy former French forts without Anishinaabe consent, and also failed to continue the French practice of providing tribute or presents to the Anishinaabe for, of course, the privilege of occupying and using those forts. This aroused concern amongst the Anishinaabe and other indigenous nations, resulting in what is known now as Pontiac's War. The efforts of Sir William Johnson during those 3 years, between 1760 and 1763, were instrumental to resolving these hostilities peacefully. In this period, Johnson's main strategy was to renew or extend the covenant chain to the Anishinaabe, making them allies of the British. The covenant chain was a diplomatic and military alliance initially established between the Dutch and then the English with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, as it was referred to in the written historical record. The covenant chain alliance signified this nation-to-nation relationship, or relationship between nations. And two key events in establishing this particular alliance relationship between the Anishinaabe and the Crown were the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was followed by the Treaty at Niagara in 1764. Now, the Royal Proclamation recognized the autonomy, independence, and territorial rights of Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe. It expressly prohibited squatting on what was called Indian territory or Indian lands. It prohibited colonial governments from granting patents on Indian lands or others making purchases of Indian lands by anyone except the Crown. So it established a treaty process, or it incorporated the existing treaty process, as I might think of it, by which the Crown could obtain the consent of Indigenous nations to share their lands through the negotiation of treaty terms. Today, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the concept of the inalienability or the inalienability of Indian lands, it's kind of a mouthful, to anyone but the Crown, is recognized as the source of fiduciary duty, the Crown's, the sui generis fiduciary relationship. And sorry, I'm getting notifications on my screen that are blocking my notes here. And the honor of the Crown and of Aboriginal title, and really of what we think of as Aboriginal law jurisprudence under Canadian law. I was muted for a second. As monumental as the proclamation was, to the Anishinaabe it was a Crown document, which had yet to reflect the consent of Indigenous nations. And Sir William Johnson knew this. Because of his knowledge and familiarity with the diplomatic protocols of the Great Lakes area, what we were talking about, the protocols for establishing treaty relationships, Johnson knew that to secure and strengthen the existing nation-to-nation relationship with the Anishinaabe would require holding a council fire. And so in 1764, Johnson held a council fire at Niagara, where he presented the Anishinaabe with the Great Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. Now, the Ontario Court of Appeal stated in the Chippewas of Sarnia case from December of 2000 that, quote, the meeting at Niagara and the Treaty of Niagara were watershed events in Crown First Nations relations. The treaty established friendly relations with many First Nations who had supported the French in the previous war. It also gave treaty recognition to the nation-to-nation relationship between the First Nations and the British Crown, Indian rights in their lands, and the process who followed when Indian lands were surrendered, end quote. So upon presenting the wampum belt, Johnson stated that, quote, you will fix one end of it with the Chippewas at St. Mary's, while the other end remain at my house, end quote. And here I want to point out something about what Johnson said with respect to the Chippewas at St. Mary's. So for those of you who are familiar, St. Mary's refers here to St. Mary's Falls, what we call Sault Ste. Marie. And so the Chippewas at St. Mary's, here in Bawating, let me just pull up my map here a bit. It's not as clear as I'd like it to be, but you can get a rough sense. Now, St. Mary's or Bawating or Sault Ste. Marie is where the Robinson-Huron Treaty Council Fire took place. The actual treaty itself was negotiated there. And so in this way, the treaty in 1850 has a direct connection to the treaty at Niagara in 1764 and the nature of the relationship that was established there. So the French called it Sault Ste. Marie, the Anishinaabe call it Baoting, which means place of the rapids. And for centuries, it was an important place of gathering and governance for the Anishinaabe. The Crown carefully maintained their relationship with the Anishinaabe from 1764 onward through strict observance of the protocols of Great Lakes diplomacy. The Crown called upon their Anishinaabe allies many times, including during the War of 1812. And I've talked a little bit about the wampum belts. I'm going to bring up a picture of the wampum belts here. So you'll see this on the screen. Now, these are all belts, and these are replicas, of course, that were included and through evidence provided by our expert, Dr. Alan Corbière. These are all belts that the British made for the Anishinaabe, including the Robinson-Huron nations, applying and adhering to Anishinaabe protocols. So the one at the top here is the belt Sir William Johnson gave at the Treaty at Niagara in 1764. And you can see on the one hand the word the numbers 17 and 64 to reflect that. And in the middle, there's two individuals holding hands, while their other hands extend to what we might think of as geometric shapes that are connected in a chain. Now, each of those shapes represent council fires, and council fires, as we've mentioned, are places of governance or sites of governance. The second belt here has the number 1786, indicating the year it was given. And on the left-hand side, you can see SR and what looks like II, but they're actually supposed to be J's, I guess, because this belt was given by Sir John Johnson, who is William Johnson's son, who had assumed the role and titles from his father upon the passing of Sir William Johnson. And so you can see, again, another belt was pledged when a new person assumed the role, and to, again, renew the same relationship according to the same understanding, principles, concepts. The third belt here was given by Lieutenant Colonel McDougall at Mackinac Island after the War of 1812. And again, you can see here on the right side a representation of the pipe of peace, which was a very important metaphor and symbol within the treaty relationship. And then this last belt here at the bottom, the fourth belt, is the Great Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. And this is, again, that belt that I was referring to that Sir William Johnson gave to the Anishinaabe at Baoting, or the Chippewas at St. Mary's, as the English were calling them then. So on the left, you can see an image that represents Turtle Island. which we talked about which Diane talked about in the story at the beginning. And on the right is a boat. So we have Turtle Island, which are the lands, indigenous lands, Anishinaabe Aki. And on the right, we have the boat, sort of the British arriving on a boat. And this chain is what anchors the British to these lands. It is what allows them to remain anchored here. It's what essentially gives them, this is their basis for connecting to the lands. So the land and the boat are connected by a chain of 24 people holding hands, and the 24 individuals represent the 24 nations who attended Niagara, who tied their hands together in friendship and formed a military alliance that stretched from Johnson's house in New York to the Anishinaabe at Baoting. Finally, you'll notice that at the center of each individual depicted on these belts is a heart. The crown and the heart, Ode in Anishinaabe, was, a central metaphor for governance and for the individual. Now, the crown depended on the military ability and readiness of the Anishinaabe during the most pivotal conflicts in this country's history. And Canada, and certainly Ontario, would not look the same today without the contributions of the thousands of Anishinaabe warriors who fought in several of the British Crown's wars between 1763 and the time of the treaty. One of those Anishinaabe warriors who is central to the Robinson-Huron Treaty is Chief Shingle. And I'll bring up this picture next. So Chief Shingle, this picture here, was taken. This is actually, we might think of it as a photograph. At the time, this is actually called a daguerreotype. And a daguerreotype was an early form of photography. And these kind of technical details about the nature of the photograph was important for sort of dating both the photo and situating, where it might have been taken, because a daguerreotype could only have been taken. There were only certain studios at the time that existed in certain places where such a photograph might have been created. But this was taken at the time of the Treaty Council. And I'll explain each of the individuals here. In the middle is Chief Shingle. And Chief Shingle was born near Mackinac Island around 1773, which would make him 77 in 1850. His mother was from Baoting. After fighting in the War of 1812, Chief Shingle would settle at Kitaganzibi, or Garden River, which is just west of Baoting, or east of Baoting, sorry. Shingle was very knowledgeable about the covenant chain relationship. He was a visionary leader and a prominent spokesperson for the Anishinaabe, and he established personal relationships with many representatives of the Crown, including Lieutenant Governor Colborne in the 1830s and Governor General Lord Elgin in the 1840s. Sorry, Lieutenant Governor Colborne in the 1830s and Governor General Lord Elgin in the 1840s, as well as many Anglican missionaries, Indian Department agents, and of course, William Benjamin Robinson, who would be appointed as the Treaty Commissioner to represent the Crown. Chief Shingle was a visionary also in the sense that he even hired his own lawyer. He hired a person by the name of Alan MacDonnell to assist him in negotiating the treaty. On the right is Chief Nebinagoching from Batchewana, who is the direct ancestor of the present-day Chief of Batchewana and one of the named plaintiffs in this case, Chief Dean Sayers. Chief Nebinagoching's father fought and was killed in the War of 1812. So at the age of 8, the British, through important council fire on Drummond Island, invested Chief Nebinagoching with his father's war medals and other symbols of authority. And so, again, this is part of that nation-to-nation relationship and the acknowledgement of representatives and acknowledgement of the system of governance and the importance of those things. So we can see in the photo that Chief Nebinagoching is wearing the medals. Chief Shingle, although it's not very clear on this photo, is wearing the medals as well. And so again, these medals were worn to reflect the importance of the relationship. Now, through their numerous representations, Chief Shingle and Chief Nemigoching frequently reminded the Crown about their treaty relationship and the principles that were embedded within it. Some of the most important records of this are captured in the pre-treaty petitions, memorials, and speeches that were authored or given by Chief Shingle and Chief Nemigoching and others in that time between about 1845 and 1850. They form an important part of the historical context for understanding the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And just, there's so many examples, but one example from a speech given in 1848 by Chief Shingle. He stated, quote, "The Great Spirit, we think, placed these rich mines on our lands for the benefit of his red children, so that the rising generation might get support from them when the animals of the woods should have grown too scarce for our subsistence. We will carry out, therefore, the object of our Father, the Great Spirit. We will sell you these lands if you give us what is right. At the same time, we want pay for every pound of mineral that has been taken off of our lands, as well as for that which may hereafter be carried away." End quote. So it's important to understand that the petitions and speeches that were made by Chief Shingle, Chief Nemigoching, and others during this time, they're prompted by unilateral actions that were taken by the colonial government, or what was called the provincial government of United Canada at the time. And the government started taking these actions in 1845, the end of 1845, and throughout the period. And these were to allow settlement and development activities on Anishinaabe lands, particularly mining permits, mining activities, some timber activities. And all of this was done without Anishinaabe consent. And all of it was contrary to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, to the relationship that was established, the Treaty at Niagara. And so the reasons for these actions by the colonial government at the time that they gave were rooted in financial pressures from the mining boom immediately south of the border in the United States, as well as what they saw was the waning importance of the Anishinaabe as military allies. And there was also an emerging view amongst colonial officials for the government that, quote, Indians had to be, quote, civilized. And this started under the Colborne policy in the 1830s and later transformed into the policy of assimilation under the Indian Act. And so it was this sort of surge in this view that led to was sort of underpinning the colonial government's actions at the time. But still, the law is the law. And so these encroachments on, quote, Indian lands were not only illegal under the Crown's law, they were a violation of the Covenant Chain Alliance. And so they were illegal under Anishinaabe law as well. The Anishinaabe saw these actions for what they were, as a direct challenge to their jurisdiction, to their relationship with the territory, and to their ongoing treaty relationship with the Crown. And this prompted the several petitions and speeches that I was referring to. And finally, it culminated in what was called the Mica Bay Incident in December of 1849. And this is when Chief Shingle, Chief Nemigoching, and a party of about 100 Anishinaabe warriors traveled from Baotsing up to Mica Bay and shut down a mine. And this level of Anishinaabe resistance, which to this point hadn't occurred, it prompted the Crown's direct representative, Lord Elgin, the Governor General, to step in and acknowledge the conduct of colonial officials violated the Royal Proclamation. And so Lord Elgin ordered the government of the day to make a treaty. And this is really what the situation was leading up to the Treaty Council in 1850. The Crown needed Anishinaabe consent to regularize mining permits and to continue allowing newcomers to develop and settle in Anishinaabe territory. The Anishinaabe were prepared to share the lands by way of a treaty, but they expected to share in the benefits. The parties entered into a sacred treaty around the Anishinaabe Council Fire at Baoting and created terms for living together that are now part of the constitutional fabric of this country. And how did we get there? Who was the person? On the left is William Benjamin Robinson. Now, William Benjamin Robinson was from a prominent family in Upper Canada. His two older brothers had fought alongside Anishinaabe warriors in the War of 1812, and they also held several prominent positions in government. Robinson himself also held positions in government as well. The second oldest brother had served as the Chief Justice of Upper Canada for 3 decades. His name was John Beverly Robinson. William Benjamin Robinson served as Minister of Finance and was also involved in many business ventures. One of these ventures was the fur trade, which was made possible by connections his older brother Peter Robinson had established with the Anishinaabe during the War of 1812. Through his experience in the fur trade, Robinson not only made connections with the Lake Huron Anishinaabe, but became familiar with Anishinaabemowin, the language spoken by the Anishinaabe. So over time, Robinson had earned a reputation among the Anishinaabe as a fair man who could be trusted. This recognition of trust and respect is something that can be seen in this image. Now, one of our expert historians, Dr. Heidi Boecker, who provided some descriptions about this daguerreotype or this image, pointed out things that were of quite significance and sort of evidence this recognition of trust and respect. So for instance, Robinson is wearing a headdress here. He's also not dressed, sort of as the typical English gentleman with this kind of headdress and, or with like top hat and suit. He's wearing what was known as a capote. And you can see here that it's got this very intricate beadwork along the bottom. Again, his leggings here also has all of this intricate beadwork, and it's possible he's wearing moccasins or some kind of shoes that were provided to him. But this is to point out that these are things that Robinson would have been gifted. These aren't things that he just goes and buys. These are important gifts, and those gifts are reflections of recognition for him and things like that. Another thing to point out about this photo or daguerreotype is that Chief Shingle in the middle has his arms, one around Robinson, one around Chief Nebitigoching. And so it symbolizes or demonstrates sort of this sort of image or this sort of reflection of a relationship of trust and of even kinship at that time. And Crown actors like Treaty Commissioner Robinson understood that the Anishinaabe saw treaty relationships as establishing responsibilities to provide mutual care as kin. And the Crown performed the role of treaty partner and invoked metaphors and language that the Anishinaabe would have understood as the Crown accepting its responsibility to deal with them as kin. So for example, at the Treaty Council at Bowting, the Treaty Council was conducted at the Anishinaabe Council Fire under the Anishinaabe systems of law and governance, respecting their ceremonies and protocols, and again, conducting the council in their language. This demonstrated to the Anishinaabe that the Crown continued to respect and acknowledge their laws and their autonomy. Another thing that happened at the council fire is that Robinson gave out pounds of tobacco and distributed many gifts, including kettles, medals of recognition, and food. Now, in the context of the treaty relationship between the Anishinaabe and the Crown, these items had an important symbolic significance of taking care of your treaty ally. These kinds of actions by the Crown demonstrated to the Anishinaabe that the Crown continued to acknowledge its obligations and responsibilities to take care of their treaty partner. Now, a third point is that even up to the time of the Treaty Council, the Crown continued to acknowledge the military assistance provided by the Anishinaabe, continued to acknowledge that important military alliance. And one example, which the judge picked up on in her reasons in stage 1, was that in September of 1849, Indian Superintendent Thomas G. Anderson presented Chief Shingle and Chief Tagawanini with medals for their services in the War of 1812. And so, again, September of 1849 is the year before the Robinson-Huron Treaty Council in 1850. Now, another thing to point out is that the presentation of these medals took place during what was called the Vidal-Anderson Commission. Thomas G. Anderson was the co-commissioner on that, and that commission was set up to investigate and to talk to as many of the Anishinaabe chiefs along the shores of Lake Huron and Lake Superior about their intentions and concerns and desires for the treaty. And so the report of the Vidal Anderson Commission was one of the key documents, if you will, for informing the basis of the treaty. So it's significant that within the context of this sort of formal commission, that one of its co-commissioners is presenting medals for recognizing military service and what they call loyalty or attachment to Her Majesty the Queen at the time. Another thing that's significant about the presentation of the medals is that it happened just weeks prior to the incident at Mica Bay, which, as I mentioned, was a critical turning point that eventually pushed the Crown and certainly prompted Governor General Lord Elgin to order the government to make a treaty to stop conducting unilateral action in terms of permitting mining and other activities in Anishinaabe in the territory. So, and it was Chief Shingle and Chief Tegawanini, the recipients of the medals, who also gave speeches to the Governor General at the opening of the Treaty Council in 1850. And we know some of this from Robinson's own diary from the Treaty Council, who remarked that it was that the opening, this formal opening of the Treaty Council, was marked with military pomp and circumstance, including, quote, declarations of attachment to the Queen. So throughout the stage 1 trial, the court heard extensive evidence like this and made key findings about the Anishinaabe perspective and about how the representatives of the Crown, from Sir William Johnson to William Benjamin Robinson, had demonstrated their understanding of the Anishinaabe perspective of the Crown-Anishinaabe treaty relationship through their actions for nearly a century. And findings like this were part of what supports findings that the trial judge made in her reasons. One of which is that at paragraph 214 of the reason, she states, quote, the location of the Treaty Council, as well as the protocols and procedures followed, indicate that the British, including Robinson, had developed at least a functional understanding of the Anishinaabe systems of law, diplomacy, and language. The trial judge found that Crown representatives and Anishinaabe leaders developed a mutually understood diplomatic discourse that they used in the decades prior to the Robinson treaties. This discourse included symbols, metaphors, ceremonies, and items of material culture. Through the alliance relationship, the British developed understandings of Anishinaabe protocols and traditions sufficiently to incorporate them into their diplomatic exchanges. Now, these sort of undisputed facts show that the Anishinaabe and the Crown were still acknowledging, again, the Covenant Chain Alliance and treating each other with mutual respect in 1815. And again, all of this is to show this is the history that leads up to the Robinson-Huron Treaty. The making of it leads up to the significance of it and informs how we understand the Robinson-Huron Treaty at the time of the treaty and also today. And so again, like Diane was saying from the outset, is that in order to understand the history of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, it's important to understand the Anishinaabe perspective of it. And so I'm sort of talking right now about some of those aspects. And I mentioned a bit at the beginning about how Robinson had demonstrated his understanding by giving gifts at the Treaty Council, tobacco, kettles, medals, and food, and how other representatives of the Crown had done that. And these were seen as deliberate acts or demonstrations of the understanding of the principle of reciprocity, one of the fundamental principles of treaty relationship. Robinson's diary at the time of the treaty records numerous occasions when he distributed gifts at the Treaty Council. And in terms of the Anishinaabe perspective, the trial judge found in her reasons that gift giving was key to the making of alliances. It was done in accordance with the principle of reciprocity, which holds that items of value are given with the expectation that the gift will be returned. And the rule of giving was that the closer the kin relationship between the people, the greater the reliance, and therefore the implication of trust. Reciprocal gift giving was representative of the alliance that included the possibility of shared spaces and resources, embodying the principle of mutual interdependence. Alliances included the mutual promise of responsibility for each other. Gift giving between the Anishinaabe and the Crown established a binding relationship between them. And the practice of annual gift giving was observed for almost 100 years prior to the making of the treaty in 1850 and continued for several years after. Another key finding from the trial judge's reasons was with respect to the council fires, their importance, their role, and she found that at these council fires, valuable gifts were exchanged as symbols of goodwill and tokens of the military and political alliance. Through gift giving, the Crown fulfilled its promise to act generously in meeting the Anishinabe's needs and to give tribute for the use of their lands. It was a way for the Crown and the Anishinaabe to reestablish and renew their relationship, acknowledge their military alliance, and reciprocate for British presence in Anishinaabe territory. The treaty relationship and the principles which governed it were articulated and understood through the actions and conduct of both of the treaty partners, how they treated each other. The Anishinaabe would have understood that their treaty relationship with the Crown would continue to be governed by the same principles that had always governed their relationship. This was found by the court in stage 1 that these principles were part of the treaty. And so what is clear is that the Robinson treaties, both from its history, from what we know about the Treaty Council, they were a continuation of the existing Crown-Anishinaabe relationship. And the Anishinaabe would have expected that the treaty, as an ongoing relationship, would be governed by the same fundamental principles which had always governed the relationship with the Crown up to that point. I have some more history that I can talk about here briefly, which is that, again, to situate what we've talked about prior and also with respect to the Covenant Chain Alliance and the nature of Crown conduct or the colonial government's conduct leading up to the treaty. And that is, again, the nature of unilateral action. And so unilateral action was something that just shouldn't happen between partners. It's something that, is not expected. It's a key principle of any treaty relationship that allies would never act unilaterally against the other, particularly in ways that might harm their treaty partner. And so, as we recall from what I was talking about earlier, which is that the unilateral actions of the British following their conquest of the French gave rise to Pontiac's War. They started to, again, occupy those, just for those who are joining. I missed this part of it, just cover briefly, that following the conquest in 1760, the British started to just assume that they could occupy French forts and French garrisons under the pretense of having conquered the French. But they didn't follow or respect the practices that the French had been adhering to, which was to provide gifts and pay tribute for the use and occupation of those posts and garrisons. And so it was this unilateral action that prompted Pontiac's War, necessitating the actions and efforts of Sir William John Johnson in those 3 years that realized the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and then the Treaty at Niagara in 1764. So unilateral action or, a discretion by a treaty partner in the absence of consent violated these fundamental principles of the treaty relationship. And in the lead up to the Robinson-Huron Treaty in 1850 is the unilateral actions of the colonial government in 1845 to issue mining permits that triggered the pre-treaty dialogue between the Anishinaabe and the representatives of the Crown. Now, again, to understand a little bit about this history and about how unilateral it was and what sort of underlied it, one example comes from the colonial government's Order in Council from January 8th of 1850, the year of the treaty, that stated that the Anishinaabe, quote, ought not to expect excessive remuneration for the partial occupation of the territory heretofore used as hunting grounds by persons who have been engaged in developing sources of wealth which they had themselves entirely neglected, end quote. And so, again, this was the colonial government's perspective of the wealth of the territory, their perspective of the Anishinaabes' understanding of that wealth or attachment to that wealth or approach to that wealth, and it's important to note that the colonial government had this perspective, but that was very distinct from the imperial crown or the British crown. And so it's in 1850 that the colonial government is expressing this view that the Anishinaabe had, quote, entirely neglected, end quote, sources of wealth within their territories. But in fact, the historical record shows the opposite. It shows that the Anishinaabe and other Great Lakes peoples had extracted, hammered, shaped, and used copper deposits and other metal and mineral deposits in their territories for over 6,000 years. The historical record contains numerous examples throughout the 17th and 18th century of Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples giving gifts of copper to their allies, including to European allies at certain points. We also have in the historical record that in 1834, which again is 16 years prior to the treaty, Lake Huron Anishinaabe provided specimens of copper to then Lieutenant Governor Colborne and asked him to send miners to help them investigate whether they could be developed further. And finally, in 1845, Chief Shingle, Chief Nebbenegoching, and other Anishinaabe showed a person by the name of J.W. Keating, who was married to Anishinaabe Kwe from Thessalon, showed him the mineral deposits at Mica Bay on Lake Superior. And from there, prompted mining claims. Keating was one of the first to stake mining claims in the area, which sparked what became this surge of mining activity. But you see, it's not that these people just went into the territory and started discovering mineral deposits. It's that the Anishinaabe had for several years been asking and had been sharing these things or offering to share them. So contrary to portrayals that there was never any intention of the treaty parties to be partners in the development of resources in the treaty territory, there's actually many examples in the historical records of attempts by the Anishinaabe to work with their treaty partners, to work with their kin in some respects, and to develop things like copper and other resources together for their mutual benefit. And this theme is recurrent throughout the treaty petitions, speeches, memorials, and council minutes, authored by Chief Shingle, Chief Nebbenegoching, and others. And it is consistent with the actions that was taken in the years leading up to the treaty. The Anishinaabe exercised their own jurisdiction. And there's examples of this as well in the historical record, where they granted mining and timber leases and partnered with others in developing sawmills. They granted land leases to missionaries and others for building churches and toll roads. However, it was officers appointed by the colonial government at the time who rejected the legitimacy of these leases, ironically on the grounds that it violated the terms of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is that it was only through the Crown that such kind of leases could be made, such kind of agreements. The irony of this is that it was the colonial government's unilateral actions that also violated those same terms, the terms of the Covenant Chain Alliance. So this is sort of that contradiction that we have in the lead up to the treaty and why the Treaty Council is so important, because we have this long history of the Covenant Chain Alliance, the terms and principles and the way in which both the Crown and the Anishinaabe had been acting in accordance with it. And then we have this period of time in the 5 years leading up to the Treaty Council where there was unilateral action by the colonial government, which harmed that treaty relationship. And so the Robinson-Huron Treaty and the Treaty Council itself is seen as something that was meant to repair those harms. And so when Robinson wrote his official report to the government at the time, at the completion of the treaty, he reported that the Anishinaabe were well satisfied with the treaty. And given all that we know about the history, about the context, the Anishinaabe would not have been satisfied with a treaty that would have permitted the colonial government to continue engaging in the business as usual that it had been doing, to continue acting unilaterally. And so just again, to summarize everything, I'm not going into the post-treaty history, which is a separate topic. But, we've talked a little bit about the history of the treaty relationship between the Anishinaabe and the Crown. We've talked about how the Anishinaabe have, since time immemorial, maintained their relationship with Anishinaabe King, maintained their relationships with the territory. The Anishinaabe understand treaties as living relationships, as sacred agreements that bring newcomers into the existing relationships with Anishinaabe King and all of creation. And through the establishment and maintenance of treaty relationships that date back as far as 1750, which incorporate the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Treaty of Niagara in 1764, and the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, the Crown was brought into that existing web of relationships across Anishinaabe King, across the territory, across all of creation. And the history of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, again, shows that the Crown has actively demonstrated its understanding of the principles that are fundamental to the treaty relationship and the obligations that it has as a treaty partner and ally to the Anishinaabe. So those are my sort of concluding comments.